This is a tutorial for the Louise Dress View A. It's a simple summer dress. It has thin straps, a self-lined bodice with a clean finished waist seam, and it has a double tiered skirt with an exposed ruffle on the bottom tier. So here I'm showing you the cut pieces. We've got the front and back bodice, which are both cut on the pair, and you need two of them. There is the top skirt tier, two of those cut on the fold, and the bottom skirt tier also cut on the fold, and you need two of those, including the straps. So here are the straps. What I'm doing here is I am folding it in half lengthwise with the right side on the outside. And I've gone and pressed that. So folding in half lengthwise with the good side out, and then folding the two long edges in towards the center and ironing again. Then we're going to go over to the machine and just edge stitch those straps closed. So we want to sew reasonably close to the edge. And that's the strap finished. So two straps, obviously. And now we're going to attach them to the outer bodice. So I've got the right sides of the front and back outer bodice up on the table, and I'm putting the straps down on top. And I've got the stitch line of the straps pointing towards the side seam, and just pinning them in place. So that's the right side of the outer bodice is up. And we're just going to secure that by machine, so just fairly close to the edge, roughly 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters or so, just to secure those straps. And I just keep the pins in because it keeps the straps straight when we come to do the neck and armhole seams. Okay, so put right sides together of the front and back bodice, and we're going to do a 1 centimeter seam. That's 3/8 of an inch. So that's joining the front and back bodices together with a 1 centimeter seam. Because the bodice is lined, we don't need to overlock this seam. And this is the bodice lining. So with right sides together, I'm going to join the side seams also with a 1 centimeter seam. And once again, we're not going to overlock because the seams will be enclosed within the garment, so there's no need. What we do need to do is press those side seams open, so the outer and the lining to have open seams. Okay, so I've been over to the iron and I've just pressed those seams open. Now I have the wrong side of the outer bodice out. I've got the right side of the lining out, and I'm going to put those two together. So I'm sliding the lining inside the outer and right sides of the fabric together. So the key message is right sides together, and we're going to sew a 6 millimeter seam all around the top edge. So that's the neck edge and the armhole edges. That's a 6 millimeter seam, which is 1/4 of an inch. And the reason we do a 1/4 of an inch here, 6 millimeters, is we don't want to cut anything away. My background is in garment manufacturing, so my patterns reflect that, and I don't do a big seam and then cut them away, just sew a small seam. Some people aren't used to that, that's fine. But there are definite advantages of just cutting your pattern to the seams you intend to finish with. Because it's a small seam, you shouldn't really need to clip into the fabric. The curves aren't so curvy. If it was a tight little armhole, you possibly would need to, but again, with a 6 millimeter or 1/4 of an inch seam, The seam allowance isn't so great that it causes any trouble, generally, depending on the fabric, but generally speaking. So what I'm doing here is I'm understitching this seam. So I am sewing on the lining side of the seam, and it's an edge stitch that's quite close to the seam, and that just understitching helps the lining sit towards the inside of the garment, and it shouldn't sort of flip out. It should be quite easy to work with. So here I've been over to the iron and pressed that bodice. As you can see the stitching, I started and stopped close to the straps, probably 2 to 2.5 centimetres, roughly an inch away from the straps. Okay, so I have not cut pockets for my light blue fabric because it's quite light and I thought it would be a bit see-through. So I'm just showing you another garment that I've made where I've inserted pockets. So to insert the pockets, you've got the right side of the front skirt up. You put the right side of the top pocket bag down, match the necks, and then you're sewing in at the neck 1 centimetre, up, and then out 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. And here I'm just understitching that seam that I've just created. And again, the understitching just helps the lining press towards the inside of the garment. So we just need to fold out those corners so that we've got a nice corner shape. If you do find puckering at those corners, it's probably because you haven't clipped in to the stitch line enough. So go back and just clip in right up to the stitch line. Okay, so I've pressed that now, and now I've got the bottom pocket bag, which I'm putting right side down, and I'm going to join those, just the pocket bag together, with a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Just careful with those quite curvy parts because they are on the bias grain, so they can stretch out. So with any bias, when you're sewing any curves that cut through a bias angle, you just need to take care not to stretch your fabric out. Okay, so we've got 1 centimetre all around the pocket bag, and then we can just go and overlock that edge, which I've done there, and I've given it a press. Okay, and then the last thing we need to do is just to secure the top and bottom of the pocket opening so it doesn't flap around. Okay, so moving back to the light blue fabric now. This is the second skirt tier, which is the bottom tier for view A. So I'm putting right sides of the front and back together and sewing the sides with a 1 centimetre seam. And while I'm here, I'm showing you this is the top tier. And again, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're putting right sides together and we're going to sew a 1 centimetre seam along those sides. You will notice that my fabric has an embroidered border, which I'm using as the hem. So I will show you what to do with the hem if you need to double turn it and create a stitched hem. If you have pockets, so this is the top skirt tier, if you have pockets, that's the right side of the front skirt up, and I'm putting the right side of the back skirt face down on top of it and sewing 1 centimetre seams. And just showing you that side seam at the machine with pockets. So as you go past the top and the bottom of the pocket mouth, I've just done a little back tack there for strength, and where the mouth is, we really want to be very careful not to catch the pocket mouth in that seam, otherwise you won't be able to slide your hand in, but otherwise it's just a normal seam. So a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch on both of the side seams. Now I've overlocked that seam and pressed the seam towards the back panel. And yes, I definitely should have matched my checks. They don't look very good, do they? Okay, so that's how to put in a pocket. Okay, and now I'm doing the side seams of the second skirt tear, 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. And same on the other side. Then I will go over to the overlocker and just overlock those seams closed and press the seams towards the back skirt, which I have just done there. Okay, so now we're going to hem the top edge of the second skirt tear, because that's going to be a little ruffle. So I'm double turning 6 millimeters, or a little bit less is better actually if you can manage it, sort of 4 millimeters and 4 millimeters. So we're looking at somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch finished. And I'm just turning this with my fingers. If you have a special foot that folds the fabric, you can have a go at that. It probably looks harder than it actually is to do this technique. It's really not workable to press that fold first. It's quite fiddly and messy. It's much better just to fold with your fingers at the machine if you can. Just give it a go. It's like any skill. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's really not as hard as you might think. Then I've just gone and done a long stitch length gathering stitch round that top edge. Okay, now that was the top skirt tear. I've overlocked the bottom edge and I've done a gathering stitch around the top of that skirt. And I'm going to now prepare to join the bottom ruffle onto the top tear. So I've just found the center of all of those panels. And I'm overlapping the second tear onto the top tear. And we're looking for an overlap of about 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm using that gathering stitch to just gather my fabric in. I know that a lot of you probably home sewers tend to do 2 gathering stitches. A lot of people find that easier. Feel free to use whatever gathering method that you're used to. I just have always done 1 gathering stitch. And I tend to manipulate the fabric at the machine as opposed to, using 1,000 of pins. But I find this method quite good. So I'm just using my snips here to just shuffle the fabric back and forth to make sure that the gathers are even. The goal is always an even spread of gather when you're joining a gathered panel onto a non-gathered panel. And I'm also using the snips just to squash that fabric down so that the presser foot doesn't sort of push those gathers flat. Okay, so you can see that I've just attached that bottom ruffle to the top tier and I'm removing my gathering stitch. You might like to do your gathering stitch in a contrast colour, so it'll be really easy to see which to remove so that you don't accidentally unpick it. Okay, and so I'm going to do a little top stitch because the only stitch that's holding these panels together is that stitch we just did before. So I'm just sewing quite close to the original stitch, about 4 millimeters, which is somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch. And just go over to the iron and steam those gathers in. If you don't have a steam iron, you're going to find gathering quite difficult. You really need steam, not a dry iron, when you're doing lots of gathers. Okay, so we are ready to join the skirt to the bodice now. So I have the right side of the skirt out and the wrong side of the bodice out. And I've just matched up those side seams and pinned them, and I've matched the centre front and centre back necks, and so now I'm just gathering the skirt to fit the bodice. You'll notice on the front bodice that there is a nick a few centimetres away from the side seam. So in between the side seam and this nick, I just do not gather the skirt. And what this does is it makes the gathers look similar on the front and back, because the front bodice is always bigger than the back bodice, which allows for a bust. But I want my skirt to be the same overall fullness. So I just have that section at the side seams on the front bodice that is flat, and it keeps the gathers centralized and the same gathering ratio as the back. So that's why that neck is there. Okay, so a centimetre seam I'm doing here. And so I've just gone past that flat bit on the front bodice that I'm talking about. So that is the bit between the side seam and the neck on the front bodice that is not gathered. Okay, just using my snips to shuffle my fabric along, make sure that my gather is even. And once I have finished this waist seam, I'm going to go over to the iron and just steam in those gathers. You don't need to overlock this seam because it will be completely encased within the bodice. So I've pressed the waist seam upwards, and now we're going to finish off the waist seam by folding the lining up. It'll be around about a centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. And we're going to pin it down now. We want an overlap of about 2 millimetres, which is roughly 1/8 of an inch. We want the lining to overlap the seam by that much so that we can actually catch the lining when we come to close this stitch. Now we'll be sewing from the right side of the garment, so we won't actually be able to see the lining. We won't be able to see this, so you do need to take care to make sure that you're pinning this in place very accurately. There I was, just transferring the pins to the outside of the garment because I need to remove them as I go. Okay, so the needle of your machine will be directly underneath the seam. And if you're new to this, just take your time because it's quite easy to wobble, and no matter how beautifully you've pinned, fabric can slip. So just take the time to make sure that that you're sewing directly underneath the seam and you are catching the lining underneath. I use my fingernail every now and then to feel the fabric underneath. You can feel where the fabric is overlapping. And yeah, just take your time with this one. If you really struggle with this step, you might like to hand baste the lining closed first, just with a long stitch so that you can remove it later. That can be quite helpful. Okay, and now the garment is actually finished. So you can go over to the iron and give it a really good press, using lots of steam on those gathers. So I'm just showing you the inside of the garment here, where the that stitch is visible. Okay, so here's the finished garment with a nice clean finished bodice, and I've been over to the iron and given it a good press and steamed the gathers in. And I'll just show you a dress that I've made that has pockets, inseam pockets there, and a stitched hem. So the hem is just a double turn 6mm or 1/4 inch hem, which is actually the same as the top edge. And that's it. So if you want to take a look at this listing, please head over to my Etsy store, Paper Doll Pattern Co. Thanks so much for watching.